Hi, and welcome to the second lesson where we're going to continue reading from chapter 1 for A Wrinkle in Time. Depending on what book you have, so 3/4 of you have this book, and this is the one I read from last time. We left off on the top of page 20, and you have the accurate pages for your vocabulary. A quarter of you have this book, and that's the one I'm going to read from today. It is also my favorite book to read from. It is my desk copy, and I've written all in it, and it has my favorite spots to stop and talk to you about things. Since some of you have a different book, your page numbers are going to be different for your vocabulary. Yesterday, we came across 2 of our words. One of them was serenity, and that was on page 5. And the other one was sullen, and that would have been on page 12 in this book. So you may need a different page number. I do give you kind of a definition in the previous lesson, but I encourage you to look them up and find a better definition. And as I said before, those words are going to come up over and over again throughout our book. So today we're going to continue to read. If you are in this book with me, we are at the very bottom of page 14, the very last part, whereas the other book we left off on the top of the page. So they were just talking about how the storm was getting worse. And the mother says that the house will hold up. It's 200 years old. But this is a hurricane, Meg wailed. The radio kept saying it was a hurricane. It's October, Mrs. Murray told her. There have been storms in October before. As Charles Wallace gave Meg her sandwich, Fortinbras came out from under the table. He gave a long, low growl, and they could see the dark fur slowly rising on his back. Meg felt her own skin prickle. "What's wrong?" she asked anxiously. Fortinbras stared at the door that opened into Mrs. Murray's laboratory, which was in the old stone dairy right off the kitchen. Beyond the lab, a pantry led outdoors, though Mrs. Murray had done her best to train the family to come into the house through the garage door or the front door and not through her lab. But it was the lab door and not the garage door toward which Fortinbras was growling. "You didn't leave any nasty smelling chemicals cooking over a Bunsen burner, did you, Mother?" Charles Wallace asked. Mrs. Murray stood up. "No, but I think I'd better go see what's upsetting Fort anyhow." "It's the tramp. I'm sure it's the tramp," Meg said nervously. "What tramp?" Charles Wallace asked. "They were saying at the post office this afternoon that a tramp stole all Mrs. Buncombe's sheets." "We'd better sit on the pillowcases then," Mrs. Murray said lightly. "I don't think even a tramp would be out on a night like this, Meg." "But that's probably why he is out," Meg wailed, trying to find a place not to be out. So I just realized some of you might be wondering what she means by a tramp. And she's probably speaking of somebody who doesn't have a home, who may be a wanderer traveling from place to place. "In which case, I'll offer him the barn till morning." Mrs. Murray went briskly to the door. "I'll go with you." Meg's voice was shrill. "No, Meg, you stay with Charles and eat your sandwich." "Eat?" Meg exclaimed as Mrs. Murray went out through the lab. "How does she expect me to eat?" "Mother can take care of herself," Charles said. "Physically, that is." But he sat in his father's chair at the table and his legs kicked at the rungs. And Charles Wallace, unlike most small children, had the ability to sit still. After a few moments that seemed like forever to Meg, Mrs. Murray came back in, holding the door open for, was it the tramp? It seemed small for Meg's idea of a tramp. The age or sex was impossible to tell, for it was completely bundled up in clothes. Several scarves of assorted colors were tied about the head, and a man's felt hat perched atop. A shocking pink stole was knotted about a rough overcoat, and black rubber boots covered the feet. "Mrs. Whatsit," Charles said suspiciously, "what are you doing here? At this time of night, too." "Now don't you be worried, my honey," a voice emerged from among the turned-up coat collar, stole, scarves, and hat. A voice like an unoiled gate, but somehow not unpleasant. "Mrs. Whatsit?" says she lost her way, Mrs. Murray said. Would you care for some hot chocolate, Mrs. Whatsit? Charmed, I'm sure, Mrs. Whatsit answered, taking off the hat and the stole. It isn't so much that I lost my way as that I got blown off course. And when I realized that I was at little Charles Wallace's house, I thought I'd just come in and rest a bit before proceeding on my way. How did you know this was Charles Wallace's house? Meg asked. By the smell. Mrs. Whatsit untied a blue and green paisley scarf, a red and yellow flowered print, a gold Liberty print, a red and black bandana. Under all this, a sparse quantity of grayish hair was tied in a small but tidy knot on top of her head. Her eyes were bright, her nose a round, soft blob, her mouth puckered like an autumn apple. My, but it's lovely and warm in here, she said. Do sit down, Mrs. Murray indicated a chair. Would you like a sandwich, Mrs. Whatsit? I've had liverwurst and cream cheese. Charles has bread and jam, and Meg lettuce and tomato. Now, let me see, Mrs. Whatsit pondered. I'm passionately fond of Russian caviar. You peaked, Charles cried indignantly. We're saving that for Mother's birthday, and you can't have any. So there was our vocabulary word, indignantly, in the yellow book that is on page 17. Those of you, hopefully you have your book out and can see that you're on page 23 in the other book. Indignantly. So he's mad. You peeked. How could she have peeked, first of all? But he thinks that she has seen that they have caviar in the cupboard. And he feels wronged by that. Indignantly, you get angry about something you think is unfair. It would be unfair if she peeked. Mrs. Whatsit gave a deep and pathetic sigh. No, Charles said. Now you mustn't give in to her, Mother, or I shall be very angry. How about tuna fish salad? All right, Mrs. Whatsit said meekly. I'll fix it, Meg offered, going to the pantry for a can of tuna fish. For crying out loud, she thought. This old woman comes barging in on us in the middle of the night, and Mother takes it as though there weren't anything peculiar about it at all. I'll bet she is the tramp. I'll bet she did steal those sheets. And she's certainly no one Charles Wallace ought to be friends with, especially when he won't even talk to ordinary people. I've only been in the neighborhood a short time, Mrs. Whatsit was saying as Meg switched off the pantry light and came back into the kitchen with the tuna fish. And I didn't think I was going to like the neighbors at all until dear little Charles came over with his dog. Mrs. Whatsit, Charles Wallace demanded severely, why did you take Mrs. Buncombe's sheets? Well, I needed them, Charles, dear. You must return them at once. But Charles, dear, I can't. I've used them. It was very wrong of you, Charles Wallace scolded. If you needed sheets that badly, you should have asked me. Mrs. Whatsit shook her head and clucked. You can't spare any sheets. Mrs. Buncombe can. Meg cut up some celery and mixed it in with the tuna. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the refrigerator door and brought out a jar of little sweet pickles. So why I'm doing it for her, I don't know, she thought as she cut them up. I don't trust her one bit. Tell your sister it's all right, Mrs. Whatsit said to Charles. Tell her my intentions are good. How does Mrs. Whatsit know what Meg's thinking? The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Charles intoned. My, but isn't he cunning? Mrs. Whatsit beamed at him fondly. It's lucky he has someone to understand him. But I'm afraid he doesn't, Mrs. Murray said. None of us is quite up to Charles. But at least you aren't trying to squash him down. Mrs. Whatsit nodded her head vigorously. You're letting him be himself. Here's your sandwich, Meg said, bringing it to Mrs. Whatsit. Do you mind if I take off my boots before I eat? Mrs. Whatsit asked, picking up the sandwich nevertheless. Listen. She moved her feet up and down in her boots, and they could hear water squelching. My toes are ever so damp. The trouble is that these boots are a mite too tight for me, and I can never take them off by myself. I'll help you, Charles offered. Not you, you're not strong enough. I'll help. Mrs. Murray squatted at Mrs. Whatsit's feet, yanking on one slick boot. When the boot came off, it came suddenly. Mrs. Murray sat down with a thump. Mrs. Whatsit went tumbling backward with the chair onto the floor, sandwich held high in one old claw. Water poured out of the boot and ran over the floor and the big braided rug. Oh, dearie me, Mrs. Whatsit said, laying on her back in the overturned chair, her feet in the air, one in a red and white striped sock, the other still booted. Mrs. Murray got to her feet. Are you all right, Mrs. Whatsit? If you have some liniment, I'll put it on my dignity, Mrs. Whatsit said, still supine. I find that line so funny. So they're afraid she's hurt herself, right? And she's like, if you have some liniment, some like ointment that I can put on. But where she has to put it on her dignity. Is that a part of your body? Or is that something that you hold dear? Right? Like, oh, my pride has been hurt. I better put some ointment on my dignity, on my pride. What a goofy phrase. I think it's sprained. Her dignity is sprained. A little oil of cloves mixed well with garlic is rather good. And she took a large bite of sandwich. Do please get up, Charles said. I don't like to see you lying there that way. You're carrying things too far. Have you ever tried to get to your feet with a sprained dignity? But Mrs. Whatsit scrambled up, righted the chair, and then sat back down on the floor. And the booted foot stuck out in front of her and took another bite. She moved with great agility for such an old woman, meaning she moves easily. At least Meg was reasonably sure that she was an old woman, and a very old woman at that. Mrs. Whatsit, her mouth full, ordered Mrs. Murray, now pull while I'm already down. Quite calmly, as though this old woman and her boots were nothing out of the ordinary, Mrs. Murray pulled until the second boot relinquished the foot, let it go. The foot was covered with a blue and gray argyle sock, and Mrs. Whatsit sat there, wriggling her toes, contentedly finishing her sandwich before scrambling to her feet. Ah, she said, that's ever so much better, and took both boots and shook them out over the sink. My stomach is full and I'm warm inside and out, and it's time I went home. Don't you think you'd better stay till morning? Mrs. Murray asked. Oh, thank you, dearie, but there's so much to do. I just can't waste time sitting around frivoling. It's much too wild a night to travel in. Wild nights are my glory, Mrs. Whatsit said. Just got caught in a downdraft and blown off course. It's an odd statement too, to be caught in a draft. Have you ever been caught off by the wind and blown off course? Well, at least till your socks are dry. Wet socks don't bother me. I just didn't like the water squishing about in my boots. Now don't worry about me, lamb. Lamb was not a word one would ordinarily think of calling Mrs. Murray. I shall just sit down for a moment and pop on my boots, and then I'll be on my way. Speaking of ways, Pet, by the way, there is such a thing as a tesseract. I'm going to pause here for a second. So I've got a big red star there. Where in the world did that statement just come from? So Mrs. Whatsit, we need to make sure we add her to our chart for chapter 1. She was introduced a few pages ago. We got lots of details about her, how she's, her character, and then what she's wearing, what she looks like. And then she makes this odd statement as well, like they were talking about it. There is such a thing as a tesseract. Nobody brought that word up. I do want to clarify too, and we didn't talk about this, but this book was written in the 1960s. This is a classic. It was written a long, long time ago. There'll be some things that happen in this book that you're not familiar with. But a lot of times we hear that word tesseract. I don't know how many of you have seen the Avengers movies. It's a different type of thing. So there is a theory in science out there about a tesseract and the idea of, I don't want to tell you yet, because if you don't know, I don't want to give it away. But I want you to realize that it is not the same thing as the way they interpreted it in the Avengers. So we'll talk about that more later on. I'd rather you wonder, what is it? Mrs. Murray's wondering too. Mrs. Murray went very white and with one hand reached backward and clutched at a chair for support. Her voice trembled. What did you say? Mrs. Whatsit tugged at her second boot. I said, she grunted, shoving her foot down in, that there is, shove, such a thing, shove, as a tesseract. Her foot went down into the boot, and grabbing shawls, scarves, and hat, she hustled out the door. Mrs. Murray sat very still, making no move to help the old woman. As the door opened, Fortinbras streaked in, panting, wet, and shiny as a seal. He looked at Mrs. Murray and whined. The door slammed. Mother, what's the matter? Meg cried. What did she say? What is it? The tesseract, Mrs. Murray whispered. What did she mean? How could she have known? That is the end of chapter 1, and we are left wondering. I'm going to end this lesson here, although there is more that I want to talk to you about in regards to your notes. So that will be a separate lesson because I'm going to teach you how to write the one piece of information. Like I said earlier, you need to go back and add in Mrs. Whatsit as a character that we meet and describe her. There is another question in there about setting, so be thinking about that. If you haven't already written your answer before the next lesson, that you think about time and place. When did this chapter take place and where are they? And that's it for chapter 1 until we get our next lesson.